Tekkaman Blade is the titular character of the 1992 anime series produced by Tatsunoko in cooperation with Sotsu. Despite the naming, the show has little to do with the original Space Knight Tekkaman series Tatsunoko produced from the 70s and is instead a full-on continuity reboot. In the future, humanity on the planet Earth had finally united and in an effort to expand space exploration, constructed a space station surrounding the planet Earth for which spaceships could dock and explore further into space. In the year 2300, a mysterious alien force named the Radam began invading Earth, and being that the orbital ring was the first line of defense, it was also the first structure to fall to the Radam, most of the staff having been killed or evacuated, and the station becoming one of many nests for the Radam. Earth, alongside its own military forces, also had a special task force dedicated to finding out and hopefully learning enough about the Radam to beat them. Enter Blade, a warrior donning a high-tech suit of armor who set out to fight the Radam. After an intense fight, he crash lands onto Earth, and with some significant memory loss at that. He comes into contact with the Space Knights, who he initially writes off and disregards, but eventually comes to realize that they need each other to be able to push back the Radam invasion and eventually all become comrades in arms. Blade, real name Takuya, would earn the name D-Boy, short for Danger Boy, owing to his reckless behavior and tendency to throw himself into danger without thinking things through. There's a bit more to it all, especially in the back half of the series, but that's basically the Cliff Notes version of the premise. I myself was actually familiar with this character prior to the inclusion in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom by virtue of it being one of the few Tatsunoko shows I actually grew up watching as a kid in its dubbed form as Technoman, which aired on UPN back in the mid-90s. It's a fun, if somewhat formulaic show at its best, and while it isn't winning any awards for anything, it's a pretty good time overall. The original Japanese version has some really great voice talent behind it, like Toshiyuki Morikawa, who also reprises his role as Blade in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, and the legendary Norio Wakamoto, who has voiced all manners of bad guys in Japanese media over the last few decades in video games and anime, including, but certainly not limited to Cell in Dragon Ball Z, Vicious in Cowboy Bebop, Bison/Vega depending on your country in Street Fighter, Dracula in Castlevania. I'd literally be here for hours if I had to recount them all. Tekkaman Blade was the first of 5 new characters revealed for the 2010 updated release of Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, subtitled Ultimate All-Stars. According to the game's producer, Blade was chosen due to being popular among the development team, but also for being a Tatsunoko property that people outside of Japan might actually be familiar with, since it did come to the West under the aforementioned Technoman name. Ultimate All-Stars was the first time Tatsunoko vs. Capcom was seeing an international release, so it made sense for Capcom to focus on adding characters with some kind of international appeal. Tekkaman Blade, as implemented in TVC, is one of my favorite fighting game characters of all time, and one of my mains in this game. He's a hard-hitting character with pretty high damage output, even without assists or damage boosts from the game's Baroque mechanic, but he does have some odd quirks, particularly in the case of his mobility, and getting the most out of him does require that you meet his somewhat tall execution barrier. Nonetheless, he's one of the most stylish characters to ever grace a Capcom fighter, and a good Tekkaman Blade player can absolutely melt your health bar before you even realize what's happened, and look cool as hell while doing so. So, without any further ado, before we get started on his moveset, we have to talk about Tekkaman Blade's standout quirk. As you may or may not be aware, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom is unique in the Versus series in that there's a universal double jump and air dash that nearly every character, save for the Giant and Alex, has access to. Alex does have an air dash, but he only gets one and he doesn't have a double jump. Blade is no different from the rest of the cast in those regards, but the way his dashes function are unique. When forward or back dashing on the ground, instead of moving either straight forward or backwards, he'll instead move upwards at a 45-degree angle in that direction. This is somewhat similar to Morrigan's atypical air dash, but it only gets weirder from there. The momentum Blade carries into any of his dashes is dependent on how you press forward. If you double tap forward or simply tap your dash macro if you have one set up, Blade will do a short dash that doesn't travel far. But if you hold after the second tap or simply hold your chosen dash macro, Blade will move incredibly far. In fact, basically the entire screen length. Because of this, Blade excels in the air, since every character with a double jump also gets an air dash per jump, and combined with his ground dash already going upwards, you can make your aerial approaches with Blade incredibly unpredictable, which works to his advantage when combined with his jumping heavy attack, one of the best jump-ins in the game thanks to its large and very active hitbox. Blade's first command normal is a downward stab attack he can do by pressing down and heavy in the air. It's a fast attack that can rarely be consistently challenged by any attempt to anti-air it thanks to how fast it is. This attack can be cancelled into from a jump cancel during an air combo, and this is part of a relaunch combo for Blade that I'll get into later. Blade's first special move is Shamshir, done by mashing any of the attack buttons. The main difference between the light, medium, and heavy variations is how many hits they do and how long the hitbox is active. I should mention that Blade has something of a themed naming scheme going on with his attack names here, in that most of his special moves are named after bladed weapons throughout history. I can only theorize as to why Capcom did this, but my guess is that it's a nod to a majority of evil Tekkaman in the Tekkaman Blade anime being named after bladed weapons as well, such as Tekkaman Dagger and Tekkaman Axe. He's not the only character in the series, or hell, even fighting games in general, to have a similar naming scheme. Sticking to the versus games here, Strider Hiryu in the Marvel games also has special moves named after mythological weapons like Brianak and Gram. A Shamshir is a type of curved sword of Persian origin, usually with an L-shaped hilt. This sometimes gets classed as a type of scimitar, especially in Western countries, but it bears mentioning that a Shamshir usually has a longer, much more narrower blade than most traditional scimitars. Given the visual effect of curved slashes in this attack, I'd say this is actually pretty appropriately named. Keeping up with the theme naming, Blade's quarter circle forward attack is Bacillard, where he fires off 2 projectiles from the tip of his lance before recalling them. The medium version angles upwards at a 45-degree angle and will have Blade teleport to the opponent for an attack if not blocked, and the heavy version goes straight but retains the teleport on hit property. This is a technique that Blade uses pretty liberally in his own series. In fact, he does it in the very first fight sequence in the show. A Bacillard is somewhere between a dagger and a short sword in size and came into popularity in Europe during the late 13th and early 14th century, before falling out of fashion sometime in the 15th century. They're most commonly distinguished for their small size, making it easy to conceal as a backup weapon during close quarters fighting, and for their hilts, often made in the shape of the letter I. Next up is Falchion, done with quarter circle back and any attack. This is a cross-up attack where Blade will dash behind the opponent, leaving his lance spinning behind him momentarily, before immediately launching across the screen. It looks trickier to block than it actually is though. As long as you're blocking away from whatever direction Blade is at, you'll be fine. It does bear mentioning that all variations of this attack will cross up the opponent in the corner. Falchions are swords— no, not that one. Falchions are swords that date back to 13th century Europe at the earliest and have generally had different kinds of designs over history, including variations that veer more towards being a machete than a sword. Next up is Katzbalger, which is done by doing a flash kick charge motion. The light and medium versions are similar, with the latter dealing 1 extra hit, but the secret sauce is in the heavy variation, which has a follow-up attack where Blade continues with an attack that sends you and the opponent across the screen. This attack is a crucial part of his ability to do solo relaunch combos without the need for Baroque or assists, thanks in part to it being cancelable from a downward stab attack, though the timing is pretty tight. You can also use Baroque at any time during this attack, making for a good option to make yourself safe if the opponent somehow starts blocking the follow-up. Blade spins his weapon a lot in the show, but this looks to be specifically inspired from a maneuver he does in episode 3 of the anime. Katzbalgers are bladed sidearms that came into popularity during the 16th century Renaissance era, notable for its unique guard, usually forming an S or an 8 shape. These were generally kept on one's person as a last resort weapon in case projectiles like arrows failed to down an approaching target. Historians seem split on the most accurate English translation of the word, but the most commonly accepted explanation is that it's derived from the German words Katz or cats, Balgen or brawl, and together allude to a fight between feral cats, earning the translated moniker of cat gutter. Next is Blade's first super, Crash Intrude. If the initial hit connects, the opponent is launched into a cinematic as Blade rushes the opponent with tackles cloaked in energy multiple times before one last cinematic hit. This is taken from Blade's technique of the same name in the anime, where he will cloak himself in energy and rush his enemies, with the energy usually taking the shape of spread bird wings. The final shot of the hyper combo actually recreates one of the frames of animation from the very first time we see him initiate this attack early on in the series. Next up is Vault Tekka, done with a Dragon Punch motion in 2 attacks. This is a beam super that has a ton of startup and instead of firing straight ahead goes at a slightly upwards angle. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom has a handful of really weird atypical hyper combos like this, Zero's Rikoha, and Beautiful Joe's 6 Cannon, all of whom have incredibly situational uses. It's most easily landed as a DHC, but by and large, despite how cool it looks, you'll be using Crash Intrude more often than not if you want to win. Vault Tekka is Blade's trademark attack and one of the few things he shares in common with the original Tekkaman, though his version, much like his other energy-based attacks, have a sparkling green hue, as opposed to the red and orange color of the original Tekkaman's Vault Tekka. He uses this quite often in the anime, though he first uses it against Tekkaman Dagger in episode 2. Tekkaman's level 3 is Omnidirectional Super Vault Tekka, done with a half circle back motion and 2 attacks. He generates a field of energy around him, and if it connects with an opponent not blocking, proceeds into a cinematic attack that does a ton of damage. However, if the initial hit misses, Blade will still fire the beam attack, though it does slightly less damage and leaves him a sitting duck afterwards as he regains his composure. This attack is based off of his Super Vault Tekka, which Blade can do in his blaster form that he uses later on in the series. The attack sequence is mostly recreated faithfully in game. Blade's assist is the light version of his Katsubagurt. It comes out too slow to be of use as an anti-air or a combo extender, but it does have the occasional use. Blade has 4 in-game colors. Here's his standard one. Next is his player 2 color. Third is this green variant. It looks like a similar shade of green to Tekkaman Dagger in the anime. His last color is based on Tekkaman Evil, a major antagonist later on in the series. Tekkaman Evil was actually considered for the original release of Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, but didn't make it in for whatever reason, so it's neat to see him homaged here. Now that we've gone through his move list, let's take a look at a basic relaunch combo that uses some of the attacks we've covered so far. Stage breakdowns aren't my usual video niche, but I wanted to cover this one since it's an integral part of Tekkaman Blade lore, as well as one of my favorite stages in the Capcom fighters since they transitioned into being 2.5D. Tekkaman Blade's stage is Orbital Ring System's Cargo Bay, and was one of 2 stages added to Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Ultimate All-Stars. Unlike Tekkaman Blade, who has to be unlocked by beating arcade mode with 3 separate Tatsunoko characters, the stage can be selected right off the bat. As the name suggests, this takes place in the cargo bay area of the orbital ring, as evidenced by the cargo ships parked in the background. The window design seems to be taken from this specific room shown in an opening narration bit in episode 2, though it should be noted that it doesn't seem like they're the exact same room. Having played this game primarily at 480p on a Wii for most of the game's life until building a PC about a year or 2 ago, I'd always thought the ship parked in the background of the stage was the Blue Earth, the spaceship the Space Knights use to travel to and from space, and specifically the orbital ring. But now, seeing the assets rendered at a higher resolution, it's obvious that it's just a generic cargo ship. As mentioned earlier in the video, the orbital ring is a man-made structure surrounding the Earth, much like the Ring of Saturn, that was constructed by mankind to be a spaceport allowing for much more in-depth space exploration. When the Radam attacked, the orbital ring was the first thing to fall to them. There's a number of defensive weapons installed into the station itself, most notably the laser arrays that fire off blue-colored lasers to any approaching threats. When the Radam took over and commandeered the station, the lasers began to be used on innocent civilians on Earth. If you look out the window of the station, you can see those very same lasers being fired upon the Earth. That's kinda grim to say the least. The Radam themselves are massive, insect-like creatures that are essentially giant parasites. They seem to operate in sort of a hive mind, and generally do what they can to establish nests wherever they're at. In the background of the stage, you can see a giant Radam nest attached to the windows and walls. Occasionally in the stage, a Radam will climb into scene and begin wreaking havoc. This sets off a weirdly detailed chain of background events that actually have two different outcomes. Some United Earth military soldiers will come out and begin firing their weapons at the Radam, shouting all kinds of battle cries in the process. One of two things will happen. They'll usually fail to fend off the Radam and hastily retreat while the Radam continues to raise hell in the background. But every now and then, they'll actually succeed and defeat it, leading to this really neat bit where the soldiers will start celebrating and dancing in sync to the stage's music. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom stages are filled with little details like this, and there's actually a deceptively decent amount of stage interactivity going on here, though it's not immediately apparent at first. Maybe I'll cover more of them in the future. Speaking of the music, Orbital Ring stage music is, despite the chaos going on around it, a fast-paced, high-energy techno theme that many have noted sounds similar to Alice DJ's 1999 trance classic, Better Off Alone. There's definitely a resemblance to the song there, though I've always thought this sounded vaguely like it could fit a Tekken game as well. Like every character in the game, Tekkaman Blade has a unique text win quote against every character, but a lot of them are actually pretty generic even when directed towards certain characters, so instead I'll highlight the ones that explicitly reference specific things. This one seems like a shout out to Balzac, a recurring character in the anime. In his initial appearance in the show, he was a war correspondent, trying to figure out the secrets of Blade's armor, much to his annoyance. Here, Blade is likely referencing Aki, one of the Space Knights. She becomes one of Blade's closest companions and eventually they fall in love. It's worth noting that both June and Aki have bluish-green tinted hair, which is probably why June reminds him of her. The time limit Blade is referring to is in reference to one of the drawbacks of his armor. He can only maintain the Tekkaman Blade form for 30 minutes, and if that time limit is exceeded, he becomes uncontrollably violent and could potentially lose his mind for good, becoming a threat to any and all people around him. Pegasus is a mech that Blade rides on that's constructed for him early on into the show after the crystal he uses to transform is shattered. Inside of Pegasus are the recovered crystal shards, and Pegasus amplifies their power, giving Blade even more strength than he had before. I showed off some of the ending in the Hayato video, but here's Tekkaman Blade's ending in full. It bears mentioning that Hayato was likely chosen as the cameo in this ending as an inside joke. They're both voiced by Toshiyuki Morikawa. Tatsunoko vs. Capcom is easily the most obscure of the Capcom vs. games, and it's pretty easy to see why. It was a fighting game exclusive to a console not really known for them and the late release in said console's lifespan, on top of half of the characters in the game being virtually unknown to most of its audience, and being overshadowed just mere months after its release by the announcement of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which was not coincidentally developed by the same development team at Aiding and Capcom, production having started on Marvel 3 in 2008. It's kind of a shame, because most that have played it would say that it's easily one of the best games in the series. It's full of unique ideas that haven't really been replicated anywhere else in the Versus games, like universal air dashing and Mega Crash, the game's burst mechanic. And despite most of the Western world being unfamiliar with Tatsunoko as a whole, the characters that made it into this game are some of the coolest, most interesting characters to ever grace a Capcom fighter, and I think Tekkaman Blade is arguably the best example of that. He has a cool design, his moveset is stylish and absolutely unique, and he's a joy to play at any skill level. He's a perfect reminder that at the end of the day, even if you don't know a character's story or where they're from, as long as they're cool and fun to use, that really doesn't matter all that much. Fighting games are supposed to be cool, right? That's going to do it for this video. As always, thank you again for watching. Feel free to follow me on any of the social media listed in the description, and any likes and subscribes are greatly appreciated. Stay safe, happy, healthy, and I'll see you next video. Take care.